Hi, everyone. My name is Mariah Knowles. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And you can find me online at mariah.knowles.codes and a few other places. And today I'll be talking about coherence, specifically coherence and mixed methods research. I am pre recording this talk because tomorrow I will be running to the meeting from a summer camp that I'm teaching with fourth graders. So in the interest of giving myself time to actually make it and be prepared for a Q&A, I'm going to pre-record the talk portion of it. So yeah, here we go. So there are many ways that we might tell stories, right, of our research. I use stories in a broad sense here, but my central question is, why ought my telling be the right one? So a little bit about me, but why I'm thinking about this way. One, I'm a PhD candidate at the UW-Madison High School, and what I mean by AI ethics education is consider a few kind of background cases here, a few example cases, right? So Uber had an autonomous vehicle that killed a jaywalker. Pasco County, Florida's police department collected data on K-12 students without their parents' knowledge and then used that data for their intelligence-led policing. Google displayed search results for an old newspaper article about a man's debts and searches for him, although those debts had been irrelevant about him for many years. And these cases and other cases like it are made possible by a background data infrastructure. And what I mean by that is a network of techno-social systems. So that can include people, institutions, policies, and the systems the tech systems that we use. That collectively pertain to the generation, processing, analysis, and storage of human data. And we, as a society, right, globally are going through a period of social change right now around this data infrastructure and how we want it to look and what getting it right looks like. And higher education plays a role in that social change, a substantial role. And I studied that role using mixed methods. So what I mean by mixed methods and why am I thinking about it that way? Well, I have a background in computer science. I have a background in English rhetoric. I'm in a library and information studies program. I've taught a lot. I've taught 176.8 credit hours as of the end of this summer. My teaching spans things such as ethics, writing, research methods, programming. I do a lot of intro programming teaching, which is what the summer camp is about that I'm running, that I'll be running from. I teach a lot of stuff on web, and I teach a lot of stuff on database. I'm also part of the Ethics, Values, and Information group here in my program. I've also done research practicum with the Epistemic Analytics Lab. So the EVI group focuses on AI ethics questions. The Epistemic Analytics Lab uses the kinds of tools that I'll talk about later in learning analytics. And now I'm a project assistant for the Wisconsin Center for Ed Research. And all this I do mix methods of research of one kind or another. So because of my very broad background, I'm a bit of a academic Swiss Army knife. So I've needed to come up with very short ways to describe what I do. So for me, research of all the kinds that I do, which tend to be in the social science realm, only has two steps. Get the story fucking right and then tell the moral of that story. And so what I mean by a story? Well, I think about it in this way that kind of comes from Aristotle and kind of the lineage from there, that stories are composed of a set of phenomena and the interweaving between them, right? The things that we're talking about. And when we tell stories, right, we tell them with paragraph breaks of some sort, right? We the researchers make the decision to group certain events together because we believe the phenomena in those events share some sense of similarity, and we spend time discussing that group of events content and importance before we move on to the next group. And then we hang those paragraphs together into some sort of larger global narrative structure. That global structure usually has some importance itself, right? So we might break our story into various themes. We might break into a before versus after, such as before and after some medical intervention. You might tell it as a story that moves over time. We might break it into alternating accounts of two contrasting groups or so on. And all those things are getting at and displaying the phenomena of real life in different ways. So no way of telling the stories of our research is neutral. We can deepen our analytic insight, though, as we write, flesh out, investigate, and interrogate why our telling ought to be the right one. Now, usually in qualitative work, we trust it just because the qualitative story is well told. Qualitative research is often perspectival, so understood to be from the perspective of the researcher. And we humans are perfectly used to making sense from others' experiences, right? But selling us that your research is well done is harder in at least three cases. One, you actually haven't looked at all the data. So when you're trying to do this qualitative research of Twitter or Facebook or other big social media data, you only have a sampling of it. Two, you have this sensitive test you need to control for. So trying to do work in education where we know there's this nested effect of kids in classes and schools and districts and so on, or you're trying to control for some sort of continuous variable. And continuous variables and qualitative storytelling are just a weird thing to kind of think about together. Or case three, you lack the authority to claim saturation of your own experiences, right? And so what I mean by saturation is the quality that you've seen enough data to convince us that you know what you're talking about, right? And so even when you're talking about your own experiences, right, this can be challenged if you come from a marginalized community such as trans people or people talking about abortions. So research has two steps, and I see my role in these steps as a mixed methods researcher with the particular background I have, with the particular kinds of research I can be involved in, to have this role and this role only, to tell a rich qualitative story whose turns are guided by quantitative features. Now, I have an example of research out there that I didn't do, but I think is a really good example of this. So the hashtag Girls Like Us paper by Sarah Jackson et al., right? It's a large social network analysis of tweets, retweets, etc. on Twitter of people using the hashtag Girls Like Us hashtag. And so over here we have this pink network, right? This part of the network here, which is the trans women and their allies. And at the center here, we have Janet Mock and Laverne Cox, two prominent and influential trans women. And down here at the center of this green network, which is the people who aren't trans, aren't their allies, but are trying to invade that space that cause harm, there's these two accounts that when I went to go get photos of them, they no longer exist, which is just so affirming to see. And when the authors of this paper tell the story of what's going on qualitatively in this, they spend time focusing on these four accounts in particular and what they're doing in the social discourse here. They paint the rest of the network in kind of broad paint strokes, and then they describe that boundary, and they use those kind of pinpoints to describe overall this discourse around it. But why that telling of the story, right? I think it's well told. I think it's well defended that those are the things they ought to pay attention to. But there could have been any other imaginable number of ways to arrange the telling of focusing on a different set of things for different amounts of time, or maybe in a different order. So when we think about why our telling is the right one, we're going to come back down to how we justify what it is that we do. And in mixed methods research, probably there's a lot of different kinds. And so there's a lot of different ways to think about how we justify what we do. But throughout them, coherence, right? How it is that we're combining the quantitative and the qualitative, how it is they're going to inform each other. This tends to come up by some name or another. And why coherence matters depends on your stance as a researcher. So what I mean by coherence more precisely is a system of beliefs. And a system of beliefs is coherent when the members of that system, right, the various beliefs in it, the various research or claims or theories you're drawing on or so on, the members of that system mutually support one another. And my advisor likes to just use the phrase hangs together. So there's four views generally when it comes to why coherence matters, right? Coherence between quantitative and qualitative, or all the parts really of your research, is a necessary criteria that you need to meet when you're evaluating the quality of your work. But there could be other criteria that you need to meet too. View two, it's a stronger form of that, saying, well, no, coherence by itself is sufficient. If you've met coherence, you're good, right? You've done good work. View three is a weaker form that says, all right, well, maybe you need coherence, maybe not, right? It's neither necessary, it's neither sufficient, yet when you have coherent work, it boosts the quality of your work, right? Coherent work is more valuable than incoherent work. Or step view four, which is kind of a flip side of it, saying, well, no, I don't care if your work is coherent. I care that when your work is incoherent, right? Saying that incoherent work is unjustified work. So what's this look like, right? I have this sticky note metaphor that I promised in the abstract, and this is, for me, the moment that helped me the most in thinking about what I'm doing when I'm bridging qualitative and quantitative work. So imagine I have my qualitative data, which could be interview data, journal entries, tweets, etc., patient reports, whatever it is. But I have these qualitative things, and I can take them and I can arrange them on my desk in a way that I think is meaningful, right? And seems to get at something qualitatively important. And then you walk in and you're like, Mariah, what the fuck is all this mess on your desk, right? And I'm like, no, no, no. Here, I'll explain it. Over here is this theme, and over here is this theme, and over here is this theme, right? And when I'm doing that is I'm projecting into this two-dimensional space on my desk, right? These qualitative labels. We've even taken it a step further and say, well, up here isn't just one theme, but actually a connection between two themes. Over down here is connection between these two themes, and so on, right? And we don't want our research to look like this, like famous meme, right? Of madness. So the linking idea here is that if you're right about your themes, that these are actually important things and that they're real and in the data, right? And you're right about how you have arranged your themes and your data around on your desk, or at least close enough for some initial solid qualitative insight, right? And you have a grip on your data. I'll explain that in a sec. Then there is an underlying mathematical relationship, and we can use that for statistical evidence for saturation to convince people that you've seen enough to know what you're talking about for some particular claim or set of claims. And we can use that statistical, that mathematical relationship to guide the turns of our story, right? So in qualitative research, we tend to produce a matrix where the rows relate to where it is we saw something, and the columns relate to what it is that we saw, right? A theme that we saw at a certain place, and each individual cell is just a 1 or 0 saying yes or no, this didn't occur, and each of those individual cells is a claim that the researcher is making. That by some set of methods they have to justify. But if we think about this collection of ones and zeros, these collection of themes that we're seeing for each entry, think about that as a point in a high dimensional space, kind of this point cloud representation. And once we get into point cloud space, right, moving from the themes that we're seeing individually in each row and each instance of data, we can move up into this higher point cloud space and get into multi-dimensional scaling, and then start taking lessons from like data science or other kind of quantitative methods, such as doing a UMAP projection to identify local patterns in the data. And then from there, David Schaefer, the head of the Epistemic Analytics Lab, likes to use the phrase "close the interpretive loop." I like to think about this chapter from Bird by Bird, which is a book on how to write, about a 1-inch picture frame of only tell a story of that you could fit within a 1-inch picture frame, of going back through and rereading your data, like the hashtag Girls Like Us paper did, right? They did this they had this high dimensional structure, which is all of the tweets and how they relate to each other. They displayed it down into a lower dimensional space, detected clusters, color coded them, and then moved back slowly through it to identify things. They paid attention to the centers of those because that projection is one meant to identify centers, right, of importance, and boundaries of importance, and then the rest they just painted in broad swaths. But they went back and reread the data because of the quantitative features that they saw, right? And they did this slowly and then used that to kind of re-guide the initial intuition that they had. So stories are composed of a set of phenomena and interweaving between them. And to me, this exactly is this matrix representation. And we hang those paragraphs together in some larger global narrative structure. To me, that initial sense of how we might arrange our story can guide our choice of what our projection would be, what quantitative method we might choose to understand that point cloud. And then when we tell stories, we tell them with paragraph breaks, right? We have some method for then taking that quantitative result, right, that lower dimensional embedding, and then rereading it qualitatively. So coherence is a system of beliefs that hangs together. And our conceptual categories, right, or qualitative codes in some fields, help explain our research questions, right, in terms of our initial qualitative understanding or our initial read of the data. Our qualitative understanding can then drive our projection or modeling the instances of those categories. And then our projected space can then provide evidence of saturation and highlight features of the structure of our data so that our telling aligns tightly with the structure that our data has underneath. So that's the kind of theoretical outset of what I'm thinking here with what coherence is, how it relates to how we justify research, and then a bit more about how we move between the quantitative and qualitative in a way that can support one another. And so I did this using my own data in the paper Telling Stories of Transitions. I have to run through this quicker than I usually do when I'd have a talk just about this. But feel free to look up the paper and read it. I believe it's open access, but if it's not, contact me on Slack and I will get it to you. So I'm trans, and many trans people decide to go through hormone replacement therapy, and at a kind of bare bones, very thin understanding of it, it involves taking one medicine to decrease, for trans women, to decrease your testosterone, and another medicine to increase your estrogen. But we know there's a lot more to it. There's a lot of these social reasons for transitioning and these real life experiences around it. And I cannot recommend the work of Julia Kay more for just seeing that in this raw kind of comic book daily diary form. And I did something similar, right? I had on a notes app on my phone this daily journal throughout my first year on HRT. And people keep journals when they're going through transitions for many reasons. One of them being it's a chance to reflect, it's a chance to see changes that you can only see in retrospect, and so on. And I was keeping this journal and going through this first year of HRT while I was learning research methods, while I was in that research practicum with the epistemic analytics lab, and I was racking my brain trying to understand some things. I said, okay, for just playing with data and trying to understand things better, I'm going to qualitatively code, right, the themes that I know are important in my own journal, right? And so I went through and coded it, producing for me that point cloud space. So I forgot a slide here about the different themes I had labeled. And so I have this point cloud now. How ought I project it down, right? What is the initial sense of the global structure that can guide my quantitative model? And so not just relying on my own sense, but relying on prior research, right? Transitions in human experiences broadly, not just gender transition. So it could be getting a new job, changing, moving countries, becoming a parent, right? Exiting a particular kind of work, or so on, right? All transitions are characterized by flow and movement over time. And transitions and experiences, when we understand that, it's important to understand the possibility of flux and variability, right? That most transition experiences involve some critical turning point, and there's some final critical turning point and some sense of becoming stable after like this initial sense, as Julia Kay calls it, right? The turbulent early stages, right? That are both turbulent but also about the mundane day-to-day life. And so with that in mind, I did use UMAP because the tools that we had in epistemic analytics lab were linear. Linear projections are really good for doing statistical testing, but for showing flux and critical breaks, they weren't very good. So I used UMAP because it's a nonlinear projection. And here, the individual dots represent individual days. The white dots represent the various themes, and the lines between them represent the various connections between them, the co-occurrences between them within some window. And red is early in time, and blue is late in time, and green is somewhere in the middle. And if we kind of move through, just eyeball the color, we see there's this movement from the bottom left when I was tracking my doses in my journal. Every time I took medicine, I would note when I took it. I don't know why, but I did. Over to when I would skip doses, right? But if we really eyeball that period closer, I'm actually bouncing back and forth between that for a bit because I did have doubts early on. And so I would stop taking medicine and I'd start taking it again, and then I'd stop, right? And then over the first summer, right, my doctor quit, my prescriptions got like messed up, and I ran out for a bit, right? But then there's this move after the initial turbulent period that's moving up, right? And the codes that are really driving up there is happiness in connection to progress, right? And that connection between happiness and progress, it's important to have this kind of rich qualitative understanding of the data. But the question here, quantitatively, is what's happening here? What was it that moved me from that turbulent early stage to that more stable later stage, right? And going back into the data and finding what it is that's contributing to that critical, that breaking point is this email from my doctor saying she was moving me to a 3-month supply of my medication. And that was important because early on, looking back at my journal, I realized that I always had doubts leading up to when I was going to go pick up prescriptions, because I was getting in my head that I would have to prove my transness or prove that I deserve this to the pharmacist for some reason. I don't know why I had that kind of instinct here, but it was one I needed to overcome. And being able to move to a 3-month dose meant I could get my medication and stabilize, have a much more consistent day-to-day life without having a kind of intense moment every month of having to like prove myself to someone, even though that never actually happened. That's how I felt. Um, and so because of that change, I was able to find the stability that I needed. And when I go back to use the kind of the linear methods of David Schaefer's lab, of the epistemic lab, or triangulate with other data, like with the kinds of selfies that I was taking, data outside the journals and so on, I can see these statistical differences of really what's going on right before that critical break, right? There's a lot more connections to dose tracking, reflections about my body, and then later on, a lot more connections between progress and happiness, right? So research has 2 steps, right? In the way that I think about it from this broad mixed background. Step 1, get the story fucking right. Step 2, tell the moral of that story. And my role as a mixed methods researcher is to tell a rich qualitative story whose turns are guided by quantitative features. So when I tell the story of my first year in HRT, I structure it around certain twists and turns, right? That early on period and that email from my doctor. And I did not tell that story structured around other things that when I was initially approaching the data qualitatively, I didn't know if they would be important turning points or not, like coming out to my doctor or choosing a new name or changes to my body or so on. And those were just better to understand as just the kinds of progress I wanted to make, but they weren't structurally important compared to over the rest of the data, right? Personally important, but not structurally important. So why that telling of the story, right? We should always come back to that. And I leave you with that question. Thank you.